The Asian Shore by Thomas M. Disch. This story appeared in two collections of the author's work, Getting into Death in 1976 and Fundamental Disch in 1980. It was originally published in Damon Knight's Orbit 6 anthology in 1970 and appeared in many anthologies over the years, including but not limited to The Year's Best Science Fiction, number 4, and The Shores Beneath, and Best SF 1970, each in 1971, Science Fiction Novellas in 1975, and The Dark Descent in 1987. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Asian Shore. 1. There were voices on the cobbled street and the sounds of motors, footsteps, slamming doors, whistles, footsteps. He lived on the ground floor, so there was no way to avoid these evidences of the city's too abundant life. They accumulated in the room like so much dust, like the heaps of unanswered correspondence on the mottled tablecloth. Every night he would drag a chair into the unfurnished back room, the guest room as he liked to think of it, and look out over the tiled roofs and across the black waters of the Bosphorus at the lights of Üsküdar. But the sounds penetrated this room too. He would sit there in the darkness, drinking wine, waiting for her knock on the back door. Or he might try to read histories, books of travel, the long, dull biography of Ataturk, a kind of sedation. Sometimes he would even begin a letter to his wife. Dear Janice, no doubt you've been wondering what's become of me these last few months. But the trouble was that once that part had been written, the frail courtesies, the perfunctory reportage, he could not bring himself to say what had become of him. Voices. It was just as well that he couldn't speak the language. For a while he had studied it, taxiing 3 times a week to Robert College in Bebek, but the grammar based on assumptions wholly alien to any other language he knew, with its wavering boundaries between verbs and nouns and adjectives, withstood every assault of his incorrigibly Aristotelian mind. He sat at the back of the classroom, behind the rows of American teenagers, as sullen as convicts, as comically out of context as the machineries melting in a Dali landscape, sat there and parroted innocuous dialogues after the teacher, taking both rotes in turn, first the trustful, inquisitive John, forever wandering alone and lost in the streets of Istanbul and Ankara, then the helpful, knowing Ahmet Bey. Neither of these interlocutors would admit what had become increasingly evident with each faltering word that John spoke, that he would wander these same streets for years, inarticulate, cheated, and despised. But these lessons, while they lasted, had one great advantage. They provided an illusion of activity, an obelisk upon which the eye might focus amid the desert of each new day, something to move toward, and then something to leave behind. After the first month, it had rained a great deal, and this provided him with a good excuse for staying in. He had mopped up the major attractions of the city in 1 week, and he persisted at sightseeing long afterward, even in doubtful weather, until at last he had checked off every mosque and ruin, every museum and cistern cited in boldface in the pages of his hachette. He visited the cemetery of Eyüp, and he devoted an entire Sunday to the land walls, carefully searching for, though he could not read Greek, the inscriptions of the various Byzantine emperors. But more and more often on these excursions he would see the woman or the child, or the woman and the child together, until he came almost to dread the sight of any woman or any child in the city. It was not an unreasonable dread. And always at 9 o'clock, or 10 at the very latest, she would come knocking at the door of the apartment, or if the outer door of the building had not been left ajar by the people upstairs, at the window of the front room. She knocked patiently, in little clusters of 3 or 4 raps, spaced several seconds apart, never very loud. Sometimes, but only if she were in the hall, she would accompany her knocking with a few words in Turkish, usually, "Yavuz, Yavuz." He had asked the clerk at the mail desk of the consulate what this meant, for he couldn't find it in his dictionary. It was a common Turkish name, a man's name. His name was John Benedict Harris. He was an American. She seldom stayed out there for more than half an hour any one night, knocking and calling to him, or to this imaginary Yavuz, and he would remain all that while in the chair in the unfurnished room, drinking kavak and watching the ferries move back and forth on the dark water between Kabataş and Üsküdar, the European and the Asian shore. He had seen her first outside the fortress of Rumeli Hisar. It was the day, shortly after he'd arrived in the city, that he had come out to register at Robert College. After paying his fees and inspecting the library, he had come down the hill by the wrong path, and there it had stood, mammoth and majestically improbable, a gift. He did not know its name, and his hachette was at the hotel. There was just the raw fact of the fortress, a mass of gray stone, its towers and crenellations, the gray Bosphorus below. He angled for a photograph, but even that far away was too big. One could not frame the whole of it in a single shot. He left the road, taking a path through dry brush that promised to circle the fortress. As he approached, the walls reared higher and higher. Before such walls there could be no question of an assault. He saw her when she was about 50 feet away. She came toward him on the footpath, carrying a large bundle wrapped in newspaper and bound with twine. Her clothes were the usual motley of washed-out cotton prints that all the poorer women of the city went about in, but she did not, like most other women of her kind, attempt to pull her shawl across her face when she noticed him. But perhaps it was only that her bundle would have made this conventional gesture of modesty awkward, for after that first glance she did at least lower her eyes to the path. No, it was hard to discover any clear portent in this first encounter. As they passed each other, he stepped off the path, and she did mumble some word in Turkish. "Thank you," he supposed. He watched her until she reached the road, wondering whether she would look back, and she didn't. He followed the walls of the fortress, down the steep, crumbling hillside, to the shore road without finding an entrance. It amused him to think that there might not be one. Between the water and the Barbicans there was only a narrow strip of highway, an absolute daunting structure. The entrance, which did exist, was just to the side of the central tower. He paid 5 lira admission and another 2.5 lira to bring in his camera. Of the 3 principal towers, visitors were allowed to climb only the one at the center of the eastern wall that ran along the Bosphorus. He was out of condition and mounted the enclosed spiral staircase slowly. The stone steps had evidently been pirated from other buildings. Every so often he recognized a fragment of a classic entablature of a wholly inappropriate intaglio design, a Greek cross or some crude Byzantine eagle. Each footfall became a symbolic conquest. One could not ascend these stairs without becoming implicated in the fall of Constantinople. This staircase opened out into a kind of wooden catwalk clinging to the inner wall of the tower at a height of about 60 feet. The silo-like space was resonant with the coo and flutter of invisible pigeons, and somewhere the wind was playing with a metal door, creaking it open, banging it shut. Here, if he so wished, he might discover portents. He crept along the wooden platform, both hands grasping the iron rail stapled to the stone wall, feeling just an agreeable amount of terror, sweating nicely. It occurred to him how much this would have pleased Janice, whose enthusiasm for heights had equaled his. He wondered when, if ever, he would see her again, and what she would be like. By now, undoubtedly, she had begun divorce proceedings. Perhaps she was already no longer his wife. The platform led to another stone staircase, shorter than the first, which ascended to the creaking metal door. He pushed it open and stepped out amid a flurry of pigeons into the full dazzle of the noon, the wide splendor of the elevation, sunlight above, and the bright bow of water beneath. And beyond the water, the surreal green of the Asian hills, hundred-breasted Cybele. It seemed, all of this, to demand some kind of affirmation, a yell, but he didn't feel up to yelling or large gestures. He could only admire, at this distance, the illusion of tactility, hills as flesh, an illusion that could be heightened if he laid his hands, still sweaty from his passage along the catwalk, on the rough, warm stone of the balustrade. Looking down the side of the tower at the empty road, he saw her again, standing at the very edge of the water. She was looking up at him. When he noticed her, she lifted both hands above her head, as though signaling, and shouted something that, even if he could have heard it properly, he would surely not have understood. He supposed that she was asking to have her picture taken, so he turned the setting ring to the fastest speed to compensate for the glare from the water. She stood directly below the tower, and there seemed no way to frame an interesting composition. He released the shutter. Woman, water, asphalt road. It would be a snapshot, not a photograph, and he didn't believe in taking snapshots. The woman continued to call up to him, arms raised in that same hieratic gesture. It made no sense. He waved to her and smiled uncertainly. It was something of a nuisance, really. He would have preferred to have this scene to himself. One climbed towers, after all, in order to be alone. Altin, the man who had found his apartment for him, worked as a commission agent for carpet and jewelry shops in the Grand Bazaar. He would strike up conversations with English and American tourists and advise them what to buy and where and how much to pay. They spent one day looking and settled on an apartment building near Taksim, the commemorative traffic circle that served the European quarter of the city as a kind of Broadway. The several banks of Istanbul demonstrated their modern character here with neon signs, and in the center of the traffic circle, life-size Ataturk led a small but representative group of his countrymen toward their bright Western destiny. The apartment was thought, by Altin, to partake of this same advanced spirit. It had central heating, a sit-down toilet, a bathtub, and a defunct but prestigious refrigerator. The rent was 600 lira a month, which came to $66 at the official rate, but only $50 at the rate Altin gave. He was anxious to move out of the hotel, so he agreed to a 6-month lease. He hated it from the day he moved in, except for the shreds of a lousy sofa in the guest room, which he obliged the landlord to remove. He left everything as he found it. Even the blurry pin-ups from a Turkish girly magazine remained where they were to cover the cracks in the new plaster. He was determined to make no accommodations. He might have to live in this city. It was not required that he enjoy it. Every day he picked up his mail at the consulate. He sampled a variety of restaurants. He saw the sights and made notes for his book. On Thursdays he visited a hammam to sweat out the accumulated poisons of the week and to be kneaded and stomped by a masseur. He supervised the growth of his young mustache. He rotted like a jar of preserves left open and forgotten on the top shelf of a cupboard. He learned that there was a special Turkish word for the rolls of dirt that are scraped off the skin after a steam bath, and another that imitated the sound of boiling water. Fukr, fukr, fukr. Boiling water signified, to the Turkish mind, the first stages of sexual arousal. It was roughly equivalent to the stateside notion of electricity. Occasionally, as he began to construct his own internal map of the unpromising alleyways and ruinous staircase streets of his neighborhood, he fancied that he saw her, that same woman. It was hard to be certain. She would always be some distance away, or he might catch just a glimpse out of the corner of his eye. If it were the same woman, nothing at this stage suggested that she was pursuing him. It was, at most, a coincidence. In any case, he could not be certain. Her face had not been unusual, and he did not have the photograph to consult, for he had spoiled the entire roll of film, removing it from the camera. Sometimes, after one of these failed encounters, he would feel a slight uneasiness. It amounted to no more than that. He met the boy in Üsküdar. It was during the first severe cold spell, in mid-November, his first trip across the Bosphorus, and when he stepped off the ferry onto the very soil, or anyhow the very asphalt, of this new continent, the largest of all, he could feel the great mass of it beckoning him toward its vast eastward vortex, tugging at him, sucking at his soul. It had been his first intention, back in New York, to stop 2 months at most in Istanbul, learn the language, then into Asia. How often he had mesmerized himself with the litany of its marvels, the grand mosques of Kayseri and Sivas, of Besahir and Afyon Karahisar, the isolate grandeur of Ararat, and then, still moving east, the shores of the Caspian, Meshed, Kabul, the Himalayas. It was all these that reached out to him now, singing, stretching forth their siren arms, inviting him to their whirlpool. And he refused. Though he could feel the charm of the invitation, he refused. Though he might have wished very much to unite with them, he still refused. For he had tied himself to the mast, where he was proof against their call. He had his apartment in that city which stood just outside their reach, and he would stay there until it was time to return. In the spring, he was going back to the States. But he did allow the sirens this much, that he would abandon the rational mosque-to-mosque itinerary laid down by his hachet and entrust the rest of the day to serendipity. While the sun still shone that afternoon, they might lead him where they would. Asphalt gave way to cobbles, and cobbles to packed dirt. The squalor here was on a much less majestic scale than in Istanbul, where even the most decrepit hovels had been squeezed by the pressure of population to heights of 3 and 4 stories. In Üsküdar, the same wretched buildings sprawled across the hills like beggars whose crutches had been kicked out from under them, supine. Through their rags of unpainted wood, one could see the scabbed flesh of mud and wattle. As he threaded his way from one dirt street to the next, and found each of them sustaining this one unvarying tone, without color, without counterpoint, he began to conceive a new Asia, not of mountains and vast plains, but this same slum, rolling on perpetually across grassless hills, a continuum of drabness, of sheer dumb extent. Because he was short, and because he would not dress the part of an American, he could go through these streets without calling attention to himself. The mustache, too, probably helped. Only his conscious, observing eyes — the camera had spoiled a second roll of film and was being repaired — would have betrayed him as a tourist today. Indeed, Altin had assured him, intending, no doubt, a compliment, that as soon as he learned to speak the language he would pass for a Turk. It grew steadily colder throughout the afternoon. The wind moved a thick veil of mist over the sun and left it there. As the mists thinned and thickened, as the flat disk of sun, sinking westward, would fade and brighten, the vagaries of light whispered conflicting rumors about these houses and their dwellers. But he did not wish to stop and listen. He already knew more concerning these things than he wanted to. He set off at a quicker pace in the supposed direction of the landing stage. The boy stood crying beside a public fountain, a water faucet projecting from a crude block of concrete at the intersection of two narrow streets. 5 years old, perhaps 6. He was carrying a large plastic bucket of water in each hand, one bright red, the other turquoise. The water had splashed over his thin trousers and bare feet. At first he supposed the boy cried only because of the cold. The damp ground must be near to freezing. To walk on it in bare, wet feet. Then he saw the slippers. They were what he would have called shower slippers, small, dye-stamped ovals of blue plastic with single thongs that had to be grasped between the first and second toes. The boy would stoop over and force the thongs between his stiff, cold, reddened toes, but after only a step or two the slippers would again fall off his numb feet. With each frustrated progress, more water would slop over the sides of the buckets. He could not keep the slippers on his feet, and he would not walk off without them. With this understanding came a kind of horror, a horror of his own helplessness. He could not go up to the boy and ask him where he lived, lift him and carry him, he was so small, to his home. Nor could he scold the child's parents for having sent him out on this errand without proper shoes or winter clothes. He could not even take up the buckets and have the child lead him to his home, for each of these possibilities demanded that he be able to speak to the boy, and this he could not do. What could he do? Offer money? As well offer him, at such a moment, a pamphlet from the U.S. Information Agency. There was, in fact, nothing he could do. The boy had become aware of him. Now that he had a sympathetic audience, he let himself cry in earnest. Lowering the 2 buckets to the ground and pointing at these and the slippers, he spoke pleadingly to this grown-up stranger, to this rescuer, words in Turkish. He took a step backward, a second step, and the boy shouted at him. What message of pain or uncomprehending indignation he would never know. He turned away and ran back along the street that had brought him to this crossway. It was another hour before he found the landing stage. It had begun to snow. As he took his seat inside the ferry, he found himself glancing at the other passengers, as though expecting to find her there among them. The next day he came down with a cold. The fever rose through the night. He woke several times, and it was always their 2 faces that he carried with him from the dreams, like souvenirs whose origin and purpose have been forgotten. The woman at Rumeli Hisar, the child in Uskudar. Some part of his mind had already begun to draw the equation between them. 2. It was the thesis of his first book that the quiddity of architecture, its chief claim to an aesthetic interest, was its arbitrariness. Once the lintels were lying on the posts, once some kind of roof had been spread across the hollow space, then anything else that might be done was gratuitous. Even the lintel and the post, the roof, the space below, these were gratuitous as well. Stated thus, it was a mild enough notion. The difficulty was in training the eye to see the whole world of usual forms, patterns of brick, painted plaster, carved and carpentered wood, not as buildings and streets, but as an infinite series of free and arbitrary choices. There was no place in such a scheme for orders, styles, sophistication, taste. Every artifact of the city was anomalous, unique, but living there in the midst of it all, you could not allow yourself too fine a sense of this fact. If you did, It had been his task these last 3 or 4 years to re-educate his eye and mind to just this condition of innocence. His was the very reverse of the romantic's aims, for he did not expect to find himself when this ideal state of raw perception was reached. It never would be, of course, for innocence, like justice, is an absolute. It may be approached, but never attained. Any closer to nature. Nature, as such, did not concern him. What he sought, on the contrary, was a sense of the great artifice of things, of structures, of the immense interminable wall that has been built just to exclude nature. The attention that his first book had received showed that he had been at least partially successful, but he knew, and who better, how far short his aim had fallen, how many clauses of the perceptual social contract he had never even thought to question. So, since it was now a matter of ridding himself of the sense of the familiar, he had had to find some better laboratory for this purpose than New York, somewhere that he could be more naturally an alien. This much seemed obvious to him. It had not seemed so obvious to his wife. He did not insist. He was willing to be reasonable. He would talk about it. He talked about it whenever they were together, at dinner, at her friends' parties. His friends didn't seem to give parties. In bed. And it came down to this, that Janice objected not so much to the projected trip as to his entire program, the thesis itself. No doubt her reasons were sound. The sense of the arbitrary did not stop at architecture. It embraced, or it would if he let it, all phenomena. If there were no fixed laws that governed the furbelows and arabesques out of which a city is composed, there were equally no laws, or only arbitrary laws, which is the same as none at all, to define the relationships woven into the lattice of that city, relationships between man and man, man and woman, John and Janice. And indeed this had already occurred to him, though he had not spoken of it to her before. He had often had to stop in the midst of some quotidian ritual, like dining out, and take his bearings. As the thesis developed, as he continued to sift away layer after layer of preconception, he found himself more and more astonished at the size of the demesne that recognized the sovereignty of convention. At times he even thought he could trace in his wife's slightest gesture, or in her aptest phrase, or in a kiss, some hint of the Palladian rule-book from which it had been derived. Perhaps with practice one would be able to document the entire history of her styles, here an echo of the Gothic revival, there an imitation of Mies. When his application for a Guggenheim was rejected, he decided he would make the trip by himself, using the bit of money that was still left from the book. Though he saw no necessity for it, he had agreed to Janice's request for a divorce. They parted on the best of terms. She had even seen him to the boat. The wet snow would fall for a day, 2 days, forming knee-deep drifts in the open spaces of the city, in paved courtyards, on vacant lots. Cold winds polished the slush of streets and sidewalks to dull, gleaming, lumpy ice. The steeper hills became impassable. The snow and the ice would linger a few days, and then a sudden thaw would send it all pouring down the cobbled hillside in a single afternoon, brief alpine cataracts of refuse and brown water. A patch of tolerable weather might follow this flood, and then another blizzard. Altine assured him that this was an unusually fierce winter, unprecedented. A spiral diminishing. A tightness. And each day the light fell more obliquely across the white hills and was more quickly spent. One night, returning from a movie, he slipped on the iced cobbles just outside the door of his building, tearing both knees of his trousers beyond any possibility of repair. It was the only winter suit he had brought. Altin gave him the name of a tailor who could make another suit quickly and for less money than he would have had to pay for a ready-made. Altin did all the bargaining with the tailor and even selected the fabric, a heavy wool rayon blend of a sickly and slightly iridescent blue, the muted, imprecise color of the more unhappy breeds of pigeons. He understood nothing of the fine points of tailoring, and so he could not decide what it was about this suit, whether the shape of the lapels, the length of the back vent, the width of the pant legs, that made it seem so different from other suits he had worn, so much smaller. And yet it fitted his figure with the exactness one expects of a tailored suit. If he looked smaller now and thicker, perhaps that was how he ought to look, and his previous suits had been telling lies about him all these years. The color, too, performed some nuance of metamorphosis. His skin, balanced against this blue-gray sheen, seemed less tan than sallow. When he wore it, he became, to all appearances, a Turk. Not that he wanted to look like a Turk. Turks were, by and large, a homely lot. He only wished to avoid the other Americans who abounded here, even at this nadir of the off-season. As their numbers decreased, their gregariousness grew more implacable. The smallest sign, a copy of Newsweek or the Herald Tribune, a word of English, an airmail letter with its telltale canceled stamp, could bring them down at once in the full fury of their good fellowship. It was convenient to have some kind of camouflage, just as it was necessary to learn their haunts in order to avoid them. Divan Yolu and Cumhuriyet Kadesi, the American Library and the Consulate, as well as some 8 or 10 of the principal well-touristed restaurants. Once the winter had firmly established itself, he also put a stop to his sightseeing. 2 months of Ottoman mosques and Byzantine rubble had brought his sense of the arbitrary to so fine a pitch that he no longer required the stimulus of the monumental. His own rooms, a rickety table, the flowered drapes, the blurry, lurid pin-ups, the intersecting planes of walls and ceilings, could present as great a plenitude of problems as the grand mosques of Suleiman or Sultan Ahmet, with all their mihrabs and minbers, their stalactite niches and faïenced walls. Too great a plenitude, actually. Day and night, the rooms nagged at him. They diverted his attention from anything else he might try to do. He knew them with the enforced intimacy with which a prisoner knows his cell. Every defect of construction, every failed grace, the precise incidence of the light at each hour of the day. Had he taken the trouble to rearrange the furniture, to put up his own prints and maps, to clean the windows and scrub the floors, to fashion some kind of bookcase, all his books remained in their 2 shipping cases, he might have been able to blot out these alien presences by the sheer strength of self-assertion, as one can mask bad odors with incense or the smell of flowers. But this would have been admitting defeat. It would have shown how unequal he was to his own thesis. As a compromise, he began to spend his afternoons in a cafe a short distance down the street on which he lived. There he would sit, at the table nearest the front window, contemplating the spirals of steam that rose from the small corolla of his tea glass. At the back of the long room, beneath the tarnished brass tea urn, there were always 2 old men playing backgammon. The other patrons sat by themselves and gave no indication that their thoughts were in any way different from his. Even when no one was smoking, the air was pungent with the charcoal fires of nargilebs. Conversation of any kind was rare. The nargilés bubbled, tiny dice rattled in a leather cup, a newspaper rustled, a glass chinked against its saucer. His red notebook always lay ready at hand on the table, and on the notebook his ballpoint pen. Once he had placed them there, he had never touched them again till it was time to leave. Though less and less in the habit of analyzing sensation and motive, he was aware that the special virtue of this cafe was as a bastion, the securest he possessed, against the now omnipresent influence of the arbitrary. If he sat here peacefully, observing the requirements of the ritual, a decorum as simple as the rules of backgammon, gradually the elements in the space about him would cohere. Things settled, unproblematically, into their own contours. Taking the flower-shaped glass as its center, this glass that was now only exactly a glass of tea, his perceptions slowly spread out through the room, like the concentric ripples passing across the surface of an ornamental pond, embracing all its objects, at last, in a firm, noumenal grasp. Just so. The room was just what a room should be. It contained him. He did not take notice of the first rapping on the cafe window, though he was aware, by some small cold contraction of his thoughts, of an infringement of the rules. The second time he looked up. They were together, the woman and the child. He had seen them each on several occasions since his trip to Üsküdar 3 weeks before. The boy once on the torn-up sidewalk outside the consulate, and another time sitting on the railing of the Karakoy Bridge. Once, riding in a dolmus to Taksim, he had passed within a scant few feet of the woman, and they had exchanged a glance of unambiguous recognition, but he had never seen them together before. But could he be certain now that it was those two? He saw a woman and a child, and the woman was rapping with one bony knuckle on the window for someone's attention. For his? If he could have seen her face. He looked at the other occupants of the cafe, the backgammon players, a fat, unshaven man reading a newspaper, a dark-skinned man with spectacles and a flaring mustache, the 2 old men on opposite sides of the room puffing on nargilés. None of them paid any attention to the woman's rapping. He stared resolutely at his glass of tea, no longer a paradigm of its own necessity. It had become a foreign object, an artifact picked up out of the rubble of a buried city, a shard. The woman continued to rap at the window. At last, the owner of the cafe went outside and spoke a few sharp words to her. She left without making a reply. He sat with his cold tea another 15 minutes. Then he went out into the street. There was no sign of them. He returned the 100 yards to his apartment as calmly as he could. Once inside, he fastened the chain lock. He never went back to the cafe. When the woman came that night, knocking at his door, it was not a surprise. And every night, at 9 or at the very latest, 10 o'clock. Yavuz! Yavuz! Calling to him. He stared at the black water, the lights of the other shore. He wondered, often, when he would give in, when he would open the door. But it was surely a mistake, some accidental resemblance. He was not Yavuz. John Benedict Harris, an American. If there ever had been one, if there ever had been a Yavuz. The man who had tacked the pin-ups on the walls? 2 women, they might have been twins in heavy eye makeup, garter belts, mounted on the same white horse, lewdly smiling. A bouffant hairdo, puffy lips, drooping breasts with large brown nipples. A couch. A beach ball, her skin dark. Bikini. Laughing. Sand. The water unnaturally blue. Snapshots. Had these ever been his fantasies? If not, why could he not bring himself to take them off the walls? He had prints by Piranesi, a blow-up of Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, the Chernikov sketch. He could have covered the walls. He found himself trying to imagine of this Yavuz. What he must be like. 3. 3 days after Christmas, he received a card from his wife, postmarked Nevada. Janice, he knew, did not believe in Christmas cards. It showed an immense stretch of white desert, a salt flat, he supposed, with purple mountains in the distance, and above the purple mountains, a heavily retouched sunset. Pink. There were no figures in this landscape or any sign of vegetation. Inside, she had written, "Merry Christmas, Janice." The same day he received a manila envelope with a copy of Art News. A non-committal note from his friend Raymond was paperclipped to the cover. "Thought you might like to see this. R." In the back pages of the magazine there was a long and unsympathetic review of his book by F.R. Robertson. Robertson was known as an authority on Hegel's aesthetics. He maintained that Homo arbitrans was nothing but a compendium of truisms and, without seeming to recognize any contradiction in this, a hopelessly muddled reworking of Hegel. Years ago, he had dropped out of a course taught by Robertson after attending the first 2 lectures. He wondered if Robertson could have remembered this. The review contained several errors of fact, one misquotation, and failed to mention his central argument, which was not, admittedly, dialectical. He decided he should write a reply and laid the magazine beside his typewriter to remind himself. The same evening he spilled the better part of a bottle of wine on it, so he tore out the review and threw the magazine into the garbage with his wife's card. The necessity for a movie had compelled him into the streets and kept him in the streets, wandering from marquee to marquee, long after the drizzle of the afternoon had thickened to rain. In New York, when this mood came over him, he would take in a double bill of science fiction films or westerns on 42nd Street. But here, though cinemas abounded in the absence of television, only the glossiest Hollywood kitsch was presented with the original soundtrack. B-movies were invariably dubbed in Turkish. So obsessive was this need that he almost passed the man in the skeleton suit without noticing him. He trudged back and forth on the sidewalk, a sodden refugee from Halloween, followed by a small Hamelin of excited children. The rain had curled the corners of his poster, it served him now as an umbrella, and caused the inks to run. He could make out K-I-L space G S-T-A space L-D-A. After Ataturk, the skeleton-suited killing was the principal figure of the new Turkish folklore. Every newsstand was heaped with magazines and comics celebrating his adventures, and here he was himself, or his avatar at least, advertising his latest movie. Yes, and there, down the side street, was the theater where it was playing, Killing Istanbul'da, or Killing in Istanbul. Beneath the colossal letters, a skull-masked killing threatened to kiss a lovely and obviously reluctant blonde, while on the larger poster across the street he gunned down 2 well-dressed men. One could not decide, on the evidence of such tableaus as these, whether killing was fundamentally good, like Batman, or bad, like Fantomas. So he bought a ticket. He would find out. It was the name that intrigued him. It was distinctly an English name. He took a seat 4 rows from the front just as the feature began, immersing himself gratefully into the familiar urban imagery. Reduced to black and white and framed by darkness, the customary vistas of Istanbul possessed a heightened reality. New American cars drove through the narrow streets at perilous speeds. An old doctor was strangled by an unseen assailant. Then, for a long while, nothing of interest happened. A tepid romance developed between the blonde singer and the young architect, while a number of gangsters or diplomats tried to obtain possession of the doctor's black valise. After a confusing sequence in which 4 of these men were killed in an explosion, the valise fell into the hands of Killing, but it proved to be empty. The police chased Killing over tiled rooftops, but this was a proof only of his agility, not of his guilt. The police can often make mistakes in these matters. Killing entered, through a window, the bedroom of the blonde singer, waking her. Contrary to the advertising posters outside, he made no attempt to kiss her. He addressed her in a hollow bass voice. The editing seemed to suggest that Killing was actually the young architect whom the singer loved. But as his mask was never removed, this, too, remained in doubt. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He was certain it was she, and he would not turn around. Had she followed him to the theater? If he rose to leave, would she make a scene? He tried to ignore the pressure of the hand, staring at the screen where the young architect had just received a mysterious telegram. His hands gripped tightly into his thighs. His hands. The hands of John Benedict Harris. "Mr. Harris! Hello!" A man's voice. He turned around. It was Altine. "Altine?" Altine smiled. His face flickered. "Yes. Do you think it is anyone?" "Anyone else?" "Yes." "No." "You are seeing this movie?" "Yes." "It is not in English. It is in Turkish." "I know." Several people in nearby rows were hissing for them to be quiet. The blonde singer had gone down into one of the city's large cisterns. Bin Birderek. He himself had been there. The editing created an illusion that it was larger than it actually was. "We will come up there," Altine whispered. He nodded. Altine sat on his right, and Altine's friend took the seat remaining empty on his left. Altine introduced his friend in a whisper. His name was Yavuz. He did not speak English. Reluctantly, he shook hands with Yavuz. It was difficult, thereafter, to give his full attention to the film. He kept glancing sideways at Yavuz. He was about his own height and age, but then this seemed to be true of half the men in Istanbul. An unexceptional face, eyes that glistened moistly in the half-light reflected from the screen. Killing was climbing up the girders of the building, being constructed on a high hillside. In the distance, the Bosphorus snaked past misted hills. There was something so unappealing in almost every Turkish face. He had never been able to pin it down. Some weakness of bone structure, the narrow cheekbones, the strong vertical lines that ran down from the hollows of the eyes to the corner of the mouth itself, narrow, flat, inflexible, or some subtler disharmony among all these elements. Yavuz, a common name, the male clerk had said. In the last minutes of the movie, there was a fight between 2 figures dressed in skeleton suits, a true and a false Killing. One of them was thrown to his death from the steel beams of the unfinished building. The villain, surely, but had it been the true or the false Killing who died? And come to think of it, which of them had frightened the singer in her bedroom, strangled the old doctor, stolen the valise? "Did you like it?" Altine asked as they crowded toward the exit. "Yes, I did." "And did you understand what the people said?" "Some of it. Enough." Altine spoke for a while to Yavuz, who then turned to address his new friend from America in rapid Turkish. He shook his head apologetically. Altine and Yavuz laughed. "He says to you that you have the same suit." "Yes, I noticed that as soon as the lights came on." "Where do you go now, Mr. Harris?" "What time is it?" They were outside the theater. The rain had moderated to a drizzle. Altine looked at his watch. 7 o'clock and a half. "I must go home now." "We will come with you and buy a bottle of wine, yes?" He looked uncertainly at Yavuz. Yavuz smiled. And when she came tonight, knocking at his door and calling for Yavuz, Not tonight, Altine. No? I'm a little sick. Yes? Sick. I have a fever. My head aches. He put his hand, mimetically, to his forehead, and as he did, he could feel both the fever and the headache. Some other time, perhaps. I'm sorry. Altine shrugged skeptically. He shook hands with Altine and then with Yavuz. Clearly, they both felt they had been snubbed. Returning to his apartment, he took an indirect route that avoided the dark side streets. The tone of the movie lingered, like the taste of a liqueur, to enliven the rhythm of cars and crowds, deepen the chiaroscuro of headlights and shop windows. Once, leaving the 8th Street Cinema after Jules et Jim, he had discovered all the street signs of the village translated into French. Now, the same law of magic allowed him to think that he could understand the fragmented conversation of passers-by. The meaning of an isolated phrase registered with the self-evident, uninterpreted immediacy of fact, the nature of the words mingling with the nature of things. Just so. Each knot in the net of language slipped, without any need of explication, into place. Every nuance of glance and inflection fitted, like a tailored suit, the contours of that moment, this street, the light, his conscious mind. Inebriated by this fictive empathy, he turned into his own darker street at last, and almost walked past the woman, who fitted like every other element of the scene, so well the corner where she'd taken up her watch, without noticing her. "You!" he said, and stopped. They stood 4 feet apart, regarding each other carefully. Perhaps she had been as little prepared for this confrontation as he. Her thick hair was combed back in stiff waves from a low forehead, falling in massive parentheses to either side of her thin face. Pitted skin, flesh wrinkled in concentration around small, pale lips, and tears, yes, tears, just forming in the corners of her staring eyes. With one hand, she held a small parcel wrapped in newspaper and string. With the other, she clutched the bulky confusion of her skirts. She wore several layers of clothing, rather than a coat, against the cold. A slight erection stirred and tangled in the flap of his cotton underpants. He blushed. Once, reading a paperback edition of Krafft Ebing, the same embarrassing thing had happened. That time it had been a description of necrophilia. God, he thought, if she notices. She whispered to him, lowering her gaze. To him, to Yavuz, to come home with her. Why did he? Yavuz, Yavuz, Yavuz. She needed. And his son. I don't understand you, he insisted. Your words make no sense to me. I am an American. My name is John Benedict Harris, not Yavuz. You're making a mistake. Can't you see that? She nodded her head. Yavuz. No, not Yavuz. Yok, yok, yok. And a word that meant love, but not exactly that. Her hand tightened in the folds of her several skirts, raising them to show the thin, black-stockinged ankles. No, she moaned. Wife. His home. Yalova. His life. Damn you! Go away! Her hand let go her skirts and darted quickly to his shoulder, digging into the cheap cloth. Her other hand shoved the wrapped parcel at him. He pushed her back, but she clung fiercely, shrieking his name. Yavuz! He struck her face. She fell on the wet cobbles. He backed away. The greasy parcel was in his left hand. She pushed herself up to her feet. Tears flowed along the vertical channels from eyes to mouth. A Turkish face. Blood dripped slowly out of one nostril. She began to walk away in the direction of Taksim. And don't return. Do you understand? Stay away from me. His voice cracked. When she was out of sight, he looked at the parcel in his hands. He knew he ought not to open it, that the wisest course was to throw it into the nearest garbage can. But even as he warned himself, his fingers had snapped the string. A large, lukewarm, doughy mass of borek, and an orange. The saliva sprouted in his mouth at the acrid smell of the cheese. No! He had not had dinner that night. He was hungry. He ate it, even the orange. During the month of January, he made only 2 entries in his notebook. The first, undated, was a long extract copied from A.H. Liebayer's book on the Janissaries, the great slave corps of the sultans, the government of the Ottoman Empire in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. The passage read, quote, "Perhaps no more daring experiment has been tried on a large scale upon the face of the earth than that embodied in the Ottoman ruling institution. Its nearest ideal analog is found in the Republic of Plato, its nearest actual parallel in the Mamluk system of Egypt, but it was not restrained within the aristocratic Hellenic limitations of the first, and it subdued and outlived the second. In the United States of America, men have risen from the rude work of the backwoods to the presidential chair, but they have done so by their own effort and not through the gradations of a system carefully organized to push them forward. The Roman Catholic Church can still train a peasant to become a pope, but it has never begun by choosing its candidates almost exclusively from families which profess a hostile religion. The Ottoman system deliberately took slaves and made them ministers of state. It took boys from the sheep run and the plow tail and made them courtiers and the husbands of princesses. It took young men whose ancestors had borne the Christian name for centuries and made them rulers in the greatest of Mohammedan states, and soldiers and generals in invincible armies whose chief joy it was to beat down the cross and elevate the crescent. It never asked its novices, "Who was your father?" or "What do you know?" or even, "Can you speak our tongue?" But it studied their faces and their frames and said, "You shall be a soldier, and if you show yourself worthy, a general," or "You shall be a scholar and a gentleman, and, if the ability lies in you, a governor and a prime minister." Grandly disregarding the fabric of fundamental customs, which is called human nature, and those religious and social prejudices which are thought to be almost as deep as life itself, the Ottoman system took children forever from parents, discouraged family cares among its members through their most active years, allowed them no certain hold on property, gave them no definite promise that their sons and daughters would profit by their success and sacrifice, raised and lowered them with no regard for ancestry or previous distinction, taught them a strange law, ethics, and religion, and ever kept them conscious of a sword raised above their heads which might put an end at any moment to a brilliant career along a matchless path of human glory. End quote. The second and briefer entry was dated the 23rd of January and read as follows. "Heavy rains yesterday. I stayed in drinking. She came around at her usual hour. This morning when I put on my brown shoes to go out shopping, they were wet through. 2 hours to dry them out over the heater. Yesterday I wore only my sheepskin slippers. I did not leave the building once." 4. A human face is a construction, an artifact. The mouth is a little door, and the eyes are windows that look at the street and all the rest of it. The flesh, the bone beneath, is a wall to which any manner of ornament may be affixed. Gewgaws of whatever style or period one takes a fancy to, swags hung below the cheeks and chin, lines chiseled or smoothed away, a recession emphasized, a bit of vegetation here and there. Each addition or subtraction, however minor in itself, will affect the entire composition. Thus, the hair that he had trimmed a bit closer to the temples restores hegemony to the vertical elements of a face that is now noticeably narrower. Or is this exclusively a matter of proportion and emphasis? For he has lost weight, too. One cannot stop eating regularly without some shrinkage, and the loss has been appreciable. A new darkness has given definition to the always incipient pouches below his eyes, a darkness echoed by the new hollowness of his cheeks. But the chief agent of metamorphosis is the mustache, which has grown full enough now to obscure the modeling of his upper lip. The ends, which had first shown a tendency to droop, have developed by his nervous habit of twisting them about his fingers, the flaring upward curve of a scimitar, or pala, after which in Turkey this style of mustache is named. Pala biik. It is this, the Baroque mustache, not a face, that he sees when he looks in a mirror. Then there is the whole question of expression, its quickness, constancy, the play of intelligence, the characteristic tone, and the hundreds upon hundreds of possible gradations within the range of that tone, the eye's habits of irony and candor, the betraying tension or slackness of a lip. Yet it is scarcely necessary to go into this at all, for his face, when he sees it, or when anyone sees it, could not be said to have an expression. What was there, after all, for him to express? The blurring of edges, whole days lost, long hours awake in bed, books scattered about the room like little animal corpses to be nibbled at when he grew hungry, the endless cups of tea, the tasteless cigarettes. Wine, at least, did what it was supposed to do. It took away the sting. Not that he felt the sting these days with any poignance, but perhaps without the wine he would have. He piled the non-returnable bottles in the bathtub, exercising in this act, if in no other, the old discrimination, the compulsive tact he had made so much of in his book. The drapes were always drawn. The lights were left burning at all hours, even when he slept, even when he was out. 3 60-watt bulbs and a metal chandelier hanging just out of plumb. Voices from the street impinged, vendors in the morning, and the metallic skreek of children. At night, the radio in the apartment below, drunken arguments, scatterings of words like illuminated signs glimpsed driving on a throughway at high speeds at night. 2 bottles of wine were not enough if he started early in the afternoon, but 3 could make him sick. And though the hours crawled like wounded insects so slowly across the floor, the days rushed by in a torrent. The sunlight slipped across the Bosphorus so quickly that there was scarcely time to rise and see it. One morning, when he awoke, there was a balloon on a stick propped in the dusty flower vase atop his dresser. A crude Mickey Mouse was stenciled on the bright red rubber. He left it there, bobbing in the vase, and watched it shrivel day by day, the face turning small and black and wrinkled. The next time it was ticket stubs, 2 of them, from the Kabatas Uskudar ferry. Till that moment he had told himself it was a matter only of holding out until the spring. He had prepared himself for a siege, believing that an assault was not possible. Now he realized that he would actually have to go out there and fight. Though it was mid-February, the weather accommodated his belated resolution with a series of bright blue days, a wholly unseasonable warmth that even tricked early blossoms from a few unsuspecting trees. He went through Topkapi once again, giving a respectful, indiscriminate, and puzzled attention to the celadon ware, to golden snuff-boxes, to pearly embroidered pillows, to the portrait miniatures of the sultans, to the fossil footprint of the prophet, to Iznik tiles, to the lot. There it was, all spread out before him, heaps and masses of it. Beauty. Like a sales clerk tying price tags to items of merchandise, he would attach this favorite word of his, provisionally, to these sundry bibelots, then step back a pace or two to see how well or poorly it matched. Was this beautiful? Was that? Amazingly, none of it was beautiful. The priceless baubles all just sat there on their shelves, behind the thick glass, as unrespondent as the drab furniture back in his own room. He tried the mosques, Sultan Ahmet, Bayazit, Sehazad, Yeni Kamiai, Laleli Kamiai, the old magic, the Vitruvian trinity of commodity, firmness, and delight, had never failed him so enormously before. Even the shock of scale, the gape-mouthed peasant reverence before thick pillars and high domes, even this deserted him. Go where he would through the city, he could not get out of his room. Then the land walls, where months before he had felt himself rubbing up against the very garment of the past. He stood at the same spot where he had stood then, at the point where Mehmet the Conqueror had breached the walls. Quincunxes of granite cannonballs decorated the grass. They reminded him of the red balloon. As a last resort, he returned to Ayup. The false spring had reached a tenuous apogee, and the February light flared with deceiving brilliance from the thousand facets of white stone blanketing the steep hillside. Small flocks of 3 or 4 sheep browsed between the graves. The turbaned shafts of marble jutted in every direction but the vertical, which it was given to the cypresses to define, or lay higgledy-piggledy one atop another. No walls, no ceilings, scarcely a path through the litter. This was an architecture supremely abstract. It seemed to him to have been piled up here over the centuries just to vindicate the thesis of his book. And it worked. It worked splendidly. His mind and his eye came alive. Ideas and images coalesced. The sharp slanting light of the late afternoon caressed the jumbled marble with a cold, careful hand, like a beautician adding the last touches to an elaborate coiffure. Beauty? Here it was. Here it was abundantly. He returned the next day with his camera, redeemed from the repair shop, where it had languished for 2 months. To be on the safe side, he had asked the repairman to load it for him. He composed each picture with mathematical punctilio, fussing over the depth of field, crouching or climbing atop sepulchres for a better angle, checking each shot against the reading on the light meter, deliberately avoiding picturesque solutions and easy effects. Even taking these pains, he found that he'd gone through the 20 exposures in under 2 hours. He went up to the small cafe on the top of the hill. Here, his hachette had noted respectfully, the great Pierre Loti had been wont to come of a summer evening, to drink a glass of tea and look down the sculptured hills and through the pillars of Cyprus at the fresh waters of Europe and the Golden Horn. The cafe perpetuated the memory of this vanished glory, with pictures and mementos. Loti, in a red fez and savage mustachios, glowered at the contemporary patrons from every wall. During the First World War, Loti had remained in Istanbul, taking the part of his friend, the Turkish Sultan, against his native France. He ordered a glass of tea from a waitress who had been got up as a harem girl. Apart from the waitress, he had the cafe to himself. He sat on Pierre Loti's favorite stool. It was delicious. He felt right at home. He opened his notebook and began to write. Like an invalid taking his first walk out of doors after a long convalescence, his renascent energies caused him not only the predictable and welcome euphoria of resurrection, but also a pronounced intellectual giddiness, as though by the simple act of rising to his feet he had thrust himself up to some really dangerous height. This dizziness became most acute when, in trying to draft a reply to Robertson's review, he was obliged to return to passages in his own book. Often as not, what he found there struck him as incomprehensible. There were entire chapters that might as well have been written in ideograms or Futhorc, for all the sense they made to him now. But occasionally, cued by some remark so irrelevant to any issue at hand as to be squeezed into an embarrassed parenthesis, he would sprint off toward the most unforeseen and undesirable conclusions. Or, rather, each of these tangents led asymptotically to a single conclusion, to wit, that his book, or any book he might conceive, was worthless, and worthless not because his thesis was wrong, but precisely because it might be right. There was a realm of judgment and a realm of fact. His book, if only because it was a book, existed within the bounds of the first. There was the trivial fact of its corporeality, but in this case, as in most others, he discounted that. It was a work of criticism, a systematization of judgment, and to the extent that his system was complete, its critical apparatus must be able to measure its own scales of mensuration and judge the justice of its own decrees. But could it? Was not his system as arbitrary a construction as any silly pyramid? What was it, after all? A string of words, of more or less agreeable noises, politely assumed to correspond to certain objects and classes of objects, actions and groups of actions in the realm of fact. And by what subtle magic was this correspondence to be verified? Why, by just the assertion that it was so. This, admittedly, lacked clarity. It had come to him thick and fast, and it was colored not a little by cheap red wine. To fix its outlines a bit more firmly in his own mind, he tried to get it down in his letter to Art News. Sirs, I write to you concerning F.R. Robertson's review of my book, though the few words I have to say bear but slightly upon Mr. Robertson's oracles, as slightly perhaps as these bore upon Homo arbitrans. Only this, that as Gödel has demonstrated in mathematics, Wittgenstein in philosophy, and Duchamp, Cage, and Ashbery in their respective fields, the final statement of any system is a self-denunciation, a demonstration of how its particular little tricks are done, not by magic, as magicians have always known, but by the readiness of the magician's audience to be deceived, which readiness is the very glue of the social contract. Every system, including my own and Mr. Robertson's, is a system of more or less interesting lies, and if one begins to call these lies into question, then one ought really to begin with the first. That is to say, with the very questionable proposition on the title page, Homo arbitrans, by John Benedict Harris. Now, I ask you, Mr. Robertson, what could be more improbable than that, more tentative, more arbitrary? He sent the letter off, unsigned. 5. He had been promised his photos by Monday, so Monday morning, before the frost had thawed on the plate-glass window, he was at the shop. The same immodest, anxious interest to see his pictures of Ayup possessed him as once he had felt to see an essay or a review in print. It was as though these items, the pictures, the printed words, had the power to rescind, for a little while, his banishment to the realm of judgment, as though they said to him, "Yes, look, here we are, right in your hand. We're real, and so you must be too." The old man behind the counter, a German, looked up mournfully to gargle a mournful "Ach." "Ach, Mr. Harris, your pictures are not ready yet. Come back soon at 12 o'clock. He walked through the melting streets that were, this side of the Golden Horn, joke books of eclecticism. No mail at the consulate, which was only to be expected. 10:30. A pudding at a pudding shop. 2 lira. A cigarette. A few more jokes. A bedraggled caryatid. An Egyptian tomb. A Greek temple that had been changed by some Circean wand into a butcher shop. 11. He looked in the bookshop at the same shop-worn selection of books that he had looked at so often before. 11:30. Surely they would be ready by now. "You are here, Mr. Harris. Very good." Smiling in anticipation, he opened the envelope, removed the slim, warped stack of prints. "No. I'm afraid these aren't mine." He handed them back. He didn't want to feel them in his hand. "What?" "Those are the wrong pictures. You've made a mistake." The old man put on a pair of dirty spectacles and shuffled through the prints. He squinted at the name on the envelope. "You are Mr. Harris." "Yes, that is the name on the envelope. The envelope's all right. The pictures aren't." "It is not a mistake." "These are somebody else's snapshots. Some family picnic. You can see that." "I myself took out the roll of film from your camera. Do you remember, Mr. Harris?" He laughed uneasily. He hated scenes. He considered just walking out of the shop, forgetting all about the pictures. "Yes, I do remember, but I'm afraid you must have gotten that roll of film confused with another. I didn't take these pictures. I took pictures at the cemetery in Ayup. Does that ring a bell?" Perhaps, he thought, ring a bell was not an expression a German would understand. As a waiter whose honesty has been called into question will go over the bill again with exaggerated attention, the old man frowned and examined each of the pictures in turn. With a triumphant clearing of his throat, he laid one of the snapshots face up on the counter. "Who is that, Mr. Harris?" It was the boy. "Who? I don't know his name." The old German laughed theatrically, lifting his eyes to a witnessing heaven. "It is you, Mr. Harris. It is you." He bent over the counter. His fingers still refused to touch the print. The boy was held up in the arms of a man whose head was bent forward as though he were examining the close-cropped scalp for lice. Details were fuzzy, the lens having been mistakenly set at infinity. Was it his face? The mustache resembled his mustache, the crescents under the eyes, the hair falling forward. But the angle of the head, the lack of focus, there was room for doubt. 24 lira, please, Mr. Harris." "Yes, of course." He took a 50 lira note from his billfold. The old man dug into a lady's plastic coin purse for change. "Thank you, Mr. Harris." "Yes, I'm sorry." The old man replaced the prints in the envelope, handed them across the counter. He put the envelope in the pocket of his suit. "It was my mistake." "Goodbye." "Yes, goodbye." He stood on the street, in the sunlight, exposed. Any moment either of them might come up to him, lay a hand on his shoulder, tug at his pant leg. He could not examine the prints here. He returned to the sweet shop and spread them out in 4 rows on a marble-topped table. 20 photographs. A day's outing, as commonplace as it had been impossible. Of these 20, 3 were so overexposed as to be meaningless, and should not have been printed at all. 3 others showed what appeared to be islands or different sections of a very irregular coastline. They were unimaginatively composed, with great expanses of bleached-out sky and glaring water. Squeezed between these, the land registered merely as long dark blotches, flecked with tiny gray rectangles of buildings. There was also a view up a steep street of wooden houses and naked wintry gardens. The remaining 13 pictures showed various people and groups of people looking at the camera. A heavy-set woman in black, with black teeth, squinting into the sun, standing next to a pine tree in one picture, sitting uncomfortably on a natural stone formation in the second. An old man, dark-skinned, bald, with a flaring mustache and several days' stubble of beard. Then these two together, a very blurred print. 3 little girls standing in front of a middle-aged woman who regarded them with a pleased proprietorial air. The same 3 girls grouped around the old man, who seemed to take no notice of them whatever, and a group of 5 men. The spread-legged shadow of the man taking this picture was roughly stenciled across the pebbled foreground. And the woman, alone. The wrinkled, sallow flesh abraded to a smooth white mask by the harsh midday light. Then the boy snuggling beside her on a blanket. Nearby, small waves lapped at a narrow shingle. Then these two still together with the old woman and the 3 little girls. The contiguity of the 2 women's faces suggested a family resemblance. The figure that could be identified as himself appeared in only 3 of the pictures, once holding the boy in his arms, once with his arm around the woman's shoulders, while the boy stood before them scowling, once in a group of 13 people, all of whom had appeared in one or another of the previous shots. Only the last of these 3 was in focus. He was one of the least noticeable figures in this group, but the mustached face smiling so rigidly into the camera was undeniably his own. He had never seen these people, except, of course, for the woman and the boy, though he had hundreds of times seen people just like them in the streets of Istanbul. Nor did he recognize the plots of grass, the stands of pine, the boulders, the shingle beach, though once again they were of such a generic type that he might well have passed such places a dozen times without taking any notice of them. Was the world of fact really as characterless as this? That it was the world of fact he never for a moment doubted. And what had he to place in the balance against these evidences? A name? A face? He scanned the walls of the sweet shop for a mirror. There was none. He lifted the spoon, dripping, from his glass of tea to regard the reflection of his face, blurred and inverted, in the concave surface. As he brought the spoon closer, the image grew less distinct, then rotated through 180 degrees to present, upright, the mirror image of his staring, dilated eye. He stood on the open upper deck as the ferry churned, hooting from the deck. Like a man stepping out of doors on a blustery day, the ferry rounded the peninsular tip of the old city, leaving the quiet of the Horn for the rough, wind-whitened waters of the Sea of Marmara. A cold south wind stiffened the scarlet star and crescent on the stern mast. From this vantage, the city showed its noblest silhouette. First, the great gray horizontal mass of the Topkapi walls, then the delicate swell of the dome of St. Irena, which had been built, like a friend carefully chosen to demonstrate, by contrast, one's own virtues, just to point up the swaggering impossibility of the neighboring holy wisdom, that graceless and abstract issue of the Union commemorated on every capital within by the twined monograms of the demon emperor Justinian and his whore and consort Theodora. Then, bringing both the topographic and historic sequence to an end, the proud finality of the Blue Mosque. The ferry began to roll in the rougher water of the open sea. Clouds moved across the sun at quicker intervals to mass in the north above the dwindling city. It was 4:30. By 5 o'clock he would reach Hebeli, the island identified by both Altin and the mail clerk at the consulate as the setting of the photographs. The airline ticket to New York was in his pocket. His bags, all but the one he would take on the plane, had been packed and shipped off in a single afternoon and morning of headlong, drunken fear. Now he was safe. The certain knowledge that tomorrow he would be thousands of miles away had shored up the crumbling walls of confidence like the promise of a prophet who cannot err. Tiresias in balmy weather. Admittedly, this was the shameful safety of a route so complete that the enemy had almost captured his baggage train, but it was safety for all that, as definite as tomorrow. Indeed, this tomorrow was more definite, more present to his mind and senses than the actual limbo of its preparation, just as, when a boy, he had endured the dreadful tedium of Christmas Eve by projecting himself into the morning that would have to follow, and which, when it did finally arrive, was never so real by half as his anticipations. Because he was this safe, he dared today confront the enemy, if the enemy would confront him, head on. It risked nothing, and there was no telling what it might yield. Though if it were the frisson that he was after, then he should have stayed and seen the thing through to its end. No, this last excursion was more a gesture than an act, bravado rather than bravery. The very self-consciousness with which he had set out seemed to ensure that nothing really disastrous could happen. Had it not always been their strategy before to catch him unaware? Finally, of course, he could not explain to himself why he had gone to the ferry, bought his ticket, embarked, except that each successive act seemed to heighten the delectable sense of his own inexorable advance, a sensation at once of almost insupportable tension and of dreamlike lassitude. He could no more have turned back along this path, once he had entered on it, than at the coda of a symphony he could have refused to listen. Beauty? Oh, yes, intolerably. He had never known anything so beautiful as this. The ferry pulled into the quay of Kinali Ada, the first of the islands. People got on and off. Now the ferry turned directly into the wind, toward Burgaz. Behind them, the European coast vanished into the haze. The ferry had left the Burgaz dock and was rounding the tiny islet of Kasik. He watched with fascination as the dark hills of Kasik, Burgaz, and Kinali slipped slowly into perfect alignment with their positions in the photograph. He could almost hear the click of the shutter. And the other relationships between these simple sliding planes of sea and land, was there not something nearly as familiar in each infinitesimal shift of perspective? When he looked at these islands with his eyes half closed, attention unfocused, he could almost... But whenever he tried to take this up, however gently, between the needle-tipped compasses of analysis, it crumbled into dust. It began to snow just as the ferry approached Hebeli. He stood at the end of the pier. The ferry was moving eastward into the white air toward Boyuk Ada. He looked up a steep street of wooden houses and naked wintry gardens. Clusters of snowflakes fell on the wet cobbles and melted. At irregular intervals, street lamps glowed yellow in the dusk, but the houses remained dark. Hebeli was a summer resort. Few people lived here in the winter months. He walked halfway up the hill, then turned to the right. Certain details of woodwork, the proportion of a window, a sagging roof, caught his attention momentarily, like the flicker of wings in the foliage of a tree 20, 50, 100 yards ahead. The houses were fewer, spaced further apart. In the gardens, snow covered the leaves of cabbages. The road wound up the hill toward a stone building. It was just possible to make out the flag waving against the gray sky. He turned onto a footpath that skirted the base of the hill. It led into the pines. The thick carpet of fallen needles was more slippery than ice. He rested his cheek against the bark of a tree and heard again the camera's click, systole and diastole of his heart. He heard the water before he saw it, lapping on the beach. He stopped. He focused. He recognized the rock. He walked toward it. So encompassing was his sense of this scene, so inclusive, that he could feel the footsteps he left behind in the snow, feel the snow slowly covering them again. He stopped. It was here he had stood with the boy in his arms. The woman had held the camera to her eye with reverent awkwardness. He had bent his head forward to avoid looking directly into the glare of the setting sun. The boy's scalp was covered with the scabs of insect bites. He was ready to admit that all this had happened, the whole impossible event. He did admit it. He lifted his head proudly and smiled, as though to say, "All right, and then, no matter what you do, I'm safe, because really I'm not here at all. I'm already in New York." He laid his hands in a gesture of defiance on the outcropping of rock before him. His fingers brushed the resilient thong of the slipper. Covered with snow, the small oval of blue plastic had completely escaped his attention. He spun around to face the forest, then round again to stare at the slipper lying there. He reached for it, thinking to throw it into the water, then drew his hand back. He turned back to the forest. A man was standing just outside the line of the trees, on the path. It was too dark to discern any more of his features than that he had a mustache. On his left, the snowy beach ended in a wall of sandstone. To his right, the path swung back into the forest, and behind him the sea dragged the shingle back and forth. "Yes?" The man bent his head attentively, but said nothing. "Well, yes. Say it." The man walked back into the forest. The ferry was just pulling in as he stumbled up to the quay. He ran onto it without stopping at the booth to buy a ticket. Inside, under the electric light, he could see the tear in his trousers and a cut on the palm of his right hand. He had fallen many times on the pine needles, over rocks, in furrowed fields, on cobbles. He took a seat by the coal stove. When his breath returned to him, he found that he was shivering violently. A boy came round with a tray of tea. He bought a glass for 1 lira. He asked the boy, in Turkish, what time it was. It was 10 o'clock. The ferry pulled up to the dock. The sign over the ticket booth said, "Buyuk Ada." The ferry pulled away from the dock. The ticket-taker came for his ticket. He held out a 10 lira note and said, "Istanbul." The ticket-taker nodded his head, which meant no. "Yok." "No? Well, how much then?" "Kak para?" "Yok, Istanbul, Yalova." He took the money offered him and gave him back in exchange 8 lira and a ticket to Yalova on the Asian coast. He had got onto a ferry going in the wrong direction. He was not returning to Istanbul, but to Yalova. He explained, first in slow, precise English, then in a desperate, fragmentary Turkish, that he could not go to Yalova, that it was impossible. He produced his airline ticket, pointed at the 8 o'clock departure time, but he could not remember the Turkish word for tomorrow. Even in his desperation, he could see the futility of all this. Between Buyuk Ada and Yalova, there were no more stops, and there would be no ferries returning to Istanbul that night. When he got to Yalova, he would have to get off the boat. A woman and a boy stood at the end of the wooden dock, at the base of a cone of snowy light. The lights were turned off on the middle deck of the ferry. The man who had been standing so long at the railing stepped stiffly down to the dock. He walked directly toward the woman and the boy. Scraps of paper eddied about his feet then, caught up in a strong gust, sailed out at a great height over the dark water. The man nodded sullenly at the woman, who mumbled a few rapid words of Turkish. Then they set off, as they had so many times before, toward their home, the man leading the way, his wife and son following a few paces behind, taking the road along the shore. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.